I trusted my best friend with my home, my children, and my life while I was sick. When I finally got better, I realized she wasn't helping me anymore. She was replacing me. She wore my robe, slept in my bed, and answered to my name like I was already gone. And the scariest part wasn't what she did, it was how sure she was that I was too weak to stop her. The first thing I noticed when I came home from the hospital wasn't the quiet, it was the smell. Lavender and lemon mixed together in a way I never liked. My house had always smelled like coffee in the morning and laundry soap by afternoon, warm and familiar. This smell was clean, but it wasn't mine. I remember standing just inside the front door, leaning my weight against the wall because my legs were still shaky, and thinking maybe sickness changes your senses, maybe recovery makes everything feel unfamiliar. I told myself that before I let the thought go any further. My name is Ruth. I'm a mother of two, a wife, and until recently, a woman who believed that loyalty was something you earned by being kind and consistent. I believed that if you showed up for people, they would show up for you. That belief was the first thing that got sick, long before my body did. Before all of this, my life was simple in the way that only busy lives can be. Mornings were loud, shoes missing, toast burning while I searched for backpacks. My husband, Daniel, always forgetting his keys and kissing my cheek twice when he finally found them. I worked part-time at the library, came home to cook dinner, folded laundry with the TV on low. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and woven into all of it was my best friend, Marissa. Marissa and I had been friends since our 20s. We met when we were both newly married, both tired, both trying to figure out who we were supposed to become. She had a laugh that filled rooms and a way of listening that made you feel chosen. She never had children of her own. She said it wasn't in the cards, but she loved mine like borrowed blessings. She was at every birthday, every school play, and every late-night phone call when one of us needed to cry without being judged. When I got sick, it didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly. First the exhaustion, then the dizziness, then days when standing felt like walking through water. The diagnosis came after weeks of tests and waiting rooms and the hum of fluorescent lights. A long-term illness, the doctor said gently, something that would take months to manage, possibly longer. I remember gripping Daniel's hand and watching his jaw tighten as he nodded. I remember Marissa sitting beside me later, holding my hand and saying, "You won't do this alone, I promise." She kept that promise at first. When my energy faded, she stepped in. She cooked meals, picked up the kids, folded towels the way she always had at her own place. When the medication made me nauseous, she brushed my hair back and told me to rest. It felt like a blessing, like I had won the friendship lottery. I told people I didn't know how I'd survive without her. I said it out loud so many times that it became truth. As the weeks passed, my world got smaller. My bedroom, the couch, doctor's appointments, the sound of my children laughing somewhere down the hall while I slept through afternoons. Marissa moved into the guest room to make things easier. That was the phrase she used. Daniel hesitated at first. I saw it in his eyes. But I was so tired, tired of managing, tired of deciding, tired of feeling like a burden. So I said yes. I told myself it was temporary. I didn't see the shifts right away. Or maybe I did, but I didn't have the strength to question them. Marissa started rearranging the kitchen. She said it made more sense this way. She answered the phone when people called and said I was resting. She started signing emails to the school with both our names. We decided. We think this is best. I told myself she was helping. I told myself I was lucky. The first moment that didn't sit right was on a Tuesday afternoon. I woke up from a nap and heard my daughter, Lily, crying. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't cooperate right away. By the time I made it to the hallway, Marissa was already there, kneeling in front of Lily, wiping her tears. Lily was clinging to her like she was the safest place in the world. When Lily saw me, she hesitated, just for a second, but that second cut deeper than anything the illness had done. "It's okay," Marissa said softly, not looking at me. "I've got her." I stood there, holding on to the wall, and something cold settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet, something closer to fear. Later that night, I mentioned it to Daniel. He shrugged, tired in a way I recognized. He said, "She's just helping. You know she means well." I nodded because I didn't have the words yet. I didn't know how to explain that help had started to feel like replacement, that my life was still happening, just without me at the center of it. By the time my health began to improve, the house no longer moved at my rhythm. Dinner was served earlier. The kids asked Marissa questions they used to ask me. She knew where everything was. She spoke with confidence about routines I hadn't approved. And every time I tried to step back in, she smiled that familiar smile and said, "Don't worry, Ruth, I've got it handled." What she didn't say was that she didn't plan on giving it back. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table sipping cold tea, I watched her move around my kitchen like it belonged to her. She wore my sweater, the one Daniel had given me years ago. When I looked down at my hands, they were trembling, not from illness this time, from the quiet realization that something precious had been taken while I was too weak to guard it. And that was the moment I understood. This wasn't just about help, this was about control, and the hardest truth of all was knowing she believed I would never be strong enough to notice. The more my strength returned, the more I realized how quietly my place had been erased. It wasn't done with cruelty or shouting. It was done with smiles, with gentle corrections, with small decisions made on my behalf that added up to something much larger. I began to notice the way Marissa spoke to Daniel, not as a guest, but as a partner. They discussed grocery lists and bills in low voices at the counter, their heads bent together like conspirators. When I entered the room, the conversation would pause, then resume with a softened version meant for my ears. "We were just saying," Marissa would begin, and I would already feel like a child being caught up on adult matters. One afternoon, I decided to cook dinner. It felt like a victory just to stand at the stove. I moved slowly, carefully, determined to finish what I started. Halfway through chopping onions, Marissa came in and gently took the knife from my hand. "You're still weak," she said, her voice smooth. "Let me do it. You don't want to set yourself back." She wasn't wrong about my weakness, but something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I watched her finish the meal I had planned, adding spices I never used, changing the dish until it barely resembled my own. When we sat down to eat, the kids praised her cooking. Daniel smiled at her with gratitude. I chewed quietly, tasting nothing. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to remember when gratitude had turned into displacement. I wondered if I had imagined it all, if illness had made me sensitive, suspicious, but the feeling didn't leave. It followed me into the mornings, into the afternoons when I listened to Marissa laugh with my children while I rested. It followed me when Lily asked her for permission instead of me, when my son, Caleb, ran past me to show her his school project. These weren't accidents. They were habits forming, grooves being worn into the shape of my family. I decided to pay attention instead of retreating. I began listening more than I spoke, watching instead of resting. And what I saw frightened me. Marissa had a way of positioning herself between me and everyone else. If I started to speak, she would finish the sentence. If I offered an opinion, she would reframe it. "Ruth's still tired," she'd say kindly. "What she means is..." Daniel didn't notice. Or maybe he did and chose the comfort of not rocking the boat. Either way, I felt myself fading, becoming the quiet background presence in my own home. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had gone into the living room earlier than usual and found Marissa sitting on the couch with Daniel, their heads close together. They weren't touching, but the intimacy was there, heavy and unmistakable. When they noticed me, they sprang apart like teenagers caught doing something wrong. Daniel stood up too quickly. Marissa smiled too fast. "We were just talking about the kids' schedules," Daniel said. I nodded, my heart pounding. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, I asked Daniel directly if he thought Marissa planned to move out anytime soon. He looked surprised. "Why would she?" he asked. "She's been such a help. And honestly, Ruth, you're still recovering. We need her." We. The word echoed in my mind long after he fell asleep. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, not from grief, but from grief. Grief for the woman I had been before sickness taught everyone else how to live without me. Grief for the friend I thought I knew. Grief for myself, because somewhere along the way, I had allowed this to happen by being too afraid of appearing ungrateful. The next morning, I found my courage in an unexpected place. Lily was brushing her hair in the bathroom, standing on her tiptoes to reach the mirror. I watched her struggle for a moment before stepping in. "Let me help you," I said softly. She hesitated, then handed me the brush. As I worked through the tangles, she leaned back against me, her small body warm and familiar. "Mom," she said quietly, "are you coming back now?" The question hit me harder than any accusation could have. "I never left," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. I had left, in pieces, in moments when I chose rest over presence, silence over discomfort, and Marissa had filled every space I vacated. That afternoon, while Marissa was out grocery shopping, I opened the drawer in the kitchen where she kept her things. I told myself I wasn't snooping, just looking for a recipe card. But what I found stopped me cold. A notebook. Inside, written with careful handwriting, were schedules, plans, notes about the children's preferences, reminders about Daniel's meetings. It read like a blueprint, like someone preparing to run a household long term. On the last page was a line that made my hands shake. "Stabilizes," as if I were an obstacle to be managed, not a person reclaiming her life. I closed the notebook and put it exactly where I found it. My reflection in the microwave door looked older than I remembered, but my eyes were clear. I understood then that confrontation would not work. Marissa thrived on appearing reasonable, indispensable. If I accused her outright, she would smile and deny and remind everyone of how much she sacrificed. I needed truth, not drama. I needed patience. So I began to take my life back in small, deliberate ways. I signed my own emails again. I attended school meetings, even when it exhausted me. I cooked breakfast, even if dinner still belonged to someone else. I corrected my children gently when they asked Marissa questions meant for me. And every time she tried to step in, I thanked her and stepped forward anyway. She didn't like that. I could see it in the tightening of her jaw, the way her smiles became strained. The tension grew quietly, like a storm gathering strength. One evening, I overheard Marissa on the phone in the guest room. "She's getting stronger," she said. "It's not going exactly as planned." I didn't hear the rest, but I didn't need to. The truth was clear now. This was never about helping me recover. It was about taking over while I was too weak to resist. I waited for the right moment. I chose a Sunday afternoon when the house was calm, the children occupied, and Daniel relaxed. I asked Marissa to sit with me at the table. My voice didn't shake. "I'm better now," I said simply, "and I need my house back." She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, the mask slipped a little. "You're being emotional," she said, "after everything I've done." "I'm being honest," I replied, "and honesty doesn't require permission." Daniel watched us, confusion giving way to understanding as he saw something he'd missed for months. The air felt heavy, charged. Marissa opened her mouth to argue, but I held my hand. "I'm grateful," I said, "but gratitude doesn't mean surrender." Silence stretched between us. In that silence, I felt stronger than I had in months, not because I was healed, but because I had finally chosen myself. Marissa didn't leave that day. I hadn't expected her to. People like her rarely retreat at the first sign of resistance. They test the ground, adjust their footing, look for another angle. After our conversation at the table, she smiled tightly and said she understood. She said she only wanted what was best for me and the family. Daniel nodded, relieved, eager to believe the discomfort was over. I knew better. Something had shifted, but it hadn't ended. The house grew quieter in the days that followed. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind filled with unspoken words. Marissa stopped volunteering for everything. She withdrew just enough to look wounded. When I entered a room, she would fall silent, then sigh softly, like someone carrying an invisible burden. The children noticed. Lily asked me one night why Auntie Marissa seemed sad all the time now. I told her sometimes adults feel sad when things change. I didn't say whose change it really was. Daniel struggled the most. He wanted harmony. He wanted everyone to get along the way they had before illness complicated everything. One evening, after the kids were asleep, he asked me gently if I thought I'd been too hard on Marissa. His voice wasn't accusing, just uncertain. I looked at him across the dim kitchen, at the man I loved, and realized how easy it is for betrayal to hide behind good intentions when people are tired. "I didn't take anything away from her," I said quietly. "I took myself back." He didn't answer right away. He stared at the counter, rubbing his thumb along the edge the way he always did when he was thinking. "I didn't see it," he finally said. "I should have." That was the first apology. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it mattered. It told me he was beginning to understand that what had happened wasn't just about help overstaying its welcome. It was about someone stepping into my life and rearranging it without asking. Marissa's next move came a week later. I found her crying in the living room when I came home from a short walk. Daniel was beside her, his arm awkwardly around her shoulders. She looked up at me with red eyes. "I don't feel wanted here anymore," she said. "I gave up my apartment, I gave up my routine, I did everything I could, and now I feel like I'm being pushed out." Her words were carefully chosen: sacrifice, abandonment, guilt. I felt the familiar pull to comfort her, to smooth things over. That instinct had kept me quiet for too long. I sat down across from her instead. "I was invited to help," I said calmly, "not to replace me, and this was always meant to be temporary." She stared at me, disbelief flickering across her face. "You think I wanted this?" she asked, her voice rising. "I stepped in because you couldn't." "I couldn't," I agreed, "but I can now." The room went still. Daniel watched us both, his face pale, caught between two versions of reality. Marissa stood abruptly, wiping her cheeks. "I guess I know where I stand," she said, and walked out of the room. That night she packed some of her things, not all, just enough to send a message. The next morning she announced she'd be staying with a friend for a few days to give everyone space. Daniel looked at me, waiting for a reaction. I felt relief, but also sadness, not for what was ending, but for what I believed our friendship was. While she was gone, the house breathed differently. The children drifted back toward me without hesitation. Daniel and I talked late into the night, conversations we should have had months earlier, about boundaries, about fear, about how easily roles can shift when one person is vulnerable and another is willing to take control. I told him about the notebook. His face darkened as he listened. He asked me why I hadn't told him sooner. I told him the truth. I wasn't sure he'd believe me then. Marissa returned 3 days later with a calmness that felt rehearsed. She acted as if nothing had happened, moving through the house with quiet politeness. But something was different. She no longer acted like she belonged there. The confidence was gone, replaced by calculation. I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to falter, to get tired, to retreat again. I didn't. Instead, I made a decision I'd been avoiding. I sat her down and told her we needed to talk about a timeline. I told her I appreciated what she'd done, but it was time for her to find her own place again. I gave her a month, not out of kindness, but out of fairness. She stared at me as if I'd struck her. "After everything?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "after everything." She didn't argue, not then. She simply nodded, her eyes cold now, the warmth gone entirely. That night I heard her on the phone again. This time I didn't hide. I stood outside the guest room door and listened as she told someone she'd been used, discarded, misunderstood. She said she'd poured herself into a family that didn't deserve her. She said she'd been pushed out by a woman who couldn't accept help. I felt the familiar sting of misrepresentation, but it no longer controlled me. Let her tell her story, I thought. I would live mine. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. 2 weeks before her move-out date, I came home to find the children upset and Daniel angry in a way I'd never seen. Marissa had told the kids she might not be around much longer because I didn't want her there. She'd framed it as abandonment, as rejection. Lily was crying, convinced she'd done something wrong. Something inside me snapped, not in rage, but in clarity. I asked Marissa to sit down. The children listened from the hallway, quiet and wide-eyed. Daniel stood beside me. "This ends now," I said. "You don't involve my children in adult conflicts. You don't paint yourself as a victim to gain sympathy, and you don't stay in this house another night." She laughed then, a sharp, humorless sound. "You think you've won?" she said. "They needed me. They needed their mother, and she's right here." Daniel told her to pack her things. No debate, no delay. She stormed off, slamming doors, muttering about ungrateful people and wasted years. When she finally left, the house felt hollow and heavy all at once. The kids clung to me. Daniel wrapped his arms around all of us. We stood there for a long time, breathing together, reclaiming the space. In the weeks that followed, rumors reached me through mutual friends, stories about how I'd turned on Marissa, how she'd sacrificed everything and been thrown away. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. The people that mattered saw the truth in how my family healed, how the house slowly returned to its old rhythms, how laughter came back, cautious at first, then freer. I learned something painful and necessary through all of this. Vulnerability invites both compassion and opportunity. The difference lies in respect. Help that erases you is not help at all. And strength doesn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes it looks like sitting at your own table and refusing to give your life away again. After Marissa left, the house didn't magically return to normal. Healing is quieter than betrayal. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly, like dust in a room that's been disturbed, waiting for everything to stop moving. For days, I woke up expecting to hear her footsteps in the hallway, her voice calling out reminders. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. I kept thinking something else was going to happen, some final twist. That's what betrayal teaches you, to brace yourself even when the danger is gone. The children needed reassurance more than anything. Lily asked where Marissa had gone and whether she would come back. I told her the truth in words she could understand, that sometimes grown-ups help for a while, and sometimes they forget when it's time to step away. Caleb asked if it was his fault. I pulled him close and told him it was never his job to hold adults together. Saying it out loud felt like a promise I should have made much earlier. Daniel and I had to learn how to speak honestly again. During my illness, we had fallen into a pattern of practicality, discussing schedules and medication, avoiding anything that might crack open deeper fears. Now, with Marissa gone, there was nothing left to hide behind. One night, after the kids were asleep, we sat on the living room floor with our backs against the couch, the lights low. He told me how scared he'd been of losing me, how Marissa's presence had felt like a life raft he grabbed without questioning the cost. I told him how invisible I'd felt, how terrifying it was to watch someone else take over my life while everyone thanked them for it. We cried quietly, side by side, not blaming, just grieving what we'd both lost during those months. Physically, I wasn't fully well yet. Recovery isn't a straight line. Some days I felt strong, capable of grocery trips and long conversations. Other days my body reminded me how fragile it still was. But something had changed inside me. I no longer apologized for resting. I no longer justified my limits. I understood now that being strong didn't mean pretending I was fine. It meant knowing when to say no. The first time I ran into Marissa after she left was at the grocery store. I hadn't expected to see her. She stood in the produce aisle examining apples like nothing had happened. When she noticed me, her expression tightened. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she nodded, polite, distant. "Ruth," she said, as if we were strangers. "Marissa," I replied. That was it. No confrontation, no closure speech. I walked away feeling oddly lighter. I realized I didn't need her to understand what she'd done. I didn't need her apology. My life no longer required her participation. Some friendships don't end with explosions. They end with clarity. At home, I began reclaiming small rituals. I packed the kids' lunches again, writing notes on napkins like I used to. I reorganized the kitchen back into my own logic, moving things slowly so my body could keep up. I sat at the table in the mornings with a mug of coffee, watching sunlight crawl across the floor. These moments grounded me. They reminded me that my presence mattered, even when I was quiet. People still asked about Marissa. I learned to answer simply, "We're not close anymore." The fewer details I gave, the more peaceful I felt. I stopped trying to control the narrative. Truth has a way of settling where it belongs. One afternoon, months later, Lily came home from school with a drawing. It was our family, drawn in bright colors. I was in the center, not larger than anyone else, not heroic, just there. "This is us," she said, smiling. I held that picture longer than necessary, my throat tight. Children see more than we think. They feel absence and presence in ways adults forget. I thought often about how easily things had gone wrong, how thin the line is between support and control. Illness had taught me that asking for help is necessary, but choosing who gets access to your life is just as important. I had mistaken familiarity for safety. I had assumed love meant selflessness. I know better now. There are moments I still replay in my mind, things I wish I'd said sooner, boundaries I should have drawn earlier. But regret no longer rules me. Experience does. Wisdom, hard-earned and quietly held. I tell this story not to paint myself as a victim or Marissa as a villain. People are more complicated than that. She wanted purpose. She wanted belonging. She wanted to be needed, but she chose to take instead of support, to insert herself instead of stand beside. And I learned that compassion without boundaries invites harm. If you're listening to this and you're sick or grieving or stretched thin, I want you to hear this clearly. You are still you, even when you're weak, even when you're quiet, even when someone else seems to be doing your life better than you think you can. Help should never cost you your place in your own world. Today, my health continues to improve, slowly, patiently. I don't rush it anymore. Daniel and I are stronger, not because nothing bad happened, but because we faced it without pretending it didn't hurt. The children are settled, secure in the knowledge that their mother is here and staying. Sometimes I sit in the living room in the evening, listening to the clock tick and the house breathe. I think about how close I came to losing myself, not to illness, but to someone who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity. And I think about how choosing myself changed everything. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt replaced in your own life, I hope you remember this. You don't have to fight loudly to reclaim what's yours. Sometimes all it takes is standing your ground quietly, firmly, and refusing to disappear. Life didn't return to normal all at once. It unfolded in layers, some comforting, some uncomfortable. Without Marissa filling every gap, the small cracks in my life became visible again, and I had to decide what to do with them. There were afternoons when the house felt too quiet, when I caught myself reaching for my phone to text her out of habit, not because I missed what she had become, but because I missed who I believed she was. Grief has a strange way of disguising itself as nostalgia. Daniel noticed it too. One evening, while we folded laundry together, he asked me if I was okay. Not in the way people ask out of politeness, but the way someone asks when they're ready to hear the truth. I told him I was learning how to trust my instincts again, learning how to sit with discomfort without trying to smooth it over for everyone else. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were moving forward together instead of circling around what had happened. The children adjusted in their own ways. Lily became more affectionate, slipping her hand into mine whenever we walked somewhere together, as if she needed reassurance that I wasn't going to vanish again. Caleb grew quieter for a while, watching everything closely. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked if people can pretend to be nice for a long time. The question caught me off guard. I chose my words carefully. Some people don't know the difference between helping and taking, I said, but that doesn't mean everyone will hurt you. He seemed to think about that, then nodded. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. As my body continued to heal, my mind began sorting through the months I'd spent sidelined in my own life. I replayed conversations, gestures, moments I'd dismissed because I didn't have the energy to question them. I no longer felt ashamed of that. Survival requires triage. At the time, my priority had been getting through each day. Now that I had the strength, I allowed myself to process what it had cost. There was one task I kept putting off, cleaning out the guest room, Marissa's room. For weeks, I kept the door closed, as if that space might still belong to her if I didn't touch it. One Saturday morning, with sunlight pouring through the windows and Daniel taking the kids to the park, I finally opened the door. The room smelled faintly of her perfume. I stood there for a moment, then began. I folded the bedding, boxed up the remaining items she'd left behind, and wiped down surfaces slowly, deliberately. As I worked, I found small things that reminded me of our friendship before it soured. A mug she loved, a scarf I'd given her years ago. I didn't throw them away in anger. I packed them carefully, then set the box by the door. Letting go doesn't have to be violent. Sometimes it's quiet and thorough. When Daniel and the kids came home, the guest room was empty, not unused, but ready. Lily peeked inside and asked what it would be now. Whatever we need it to be, I told her, and I meant it. Weeks later, a mutual friend invited me out for coffee. She hesitated before bringing up Marissa, then asked if what she'd heard was true. I smiled softly and said only that people change, and sometimes you don't notice until you have to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself. The friend nodded, thoughtful. I could tell she was reevaluating her own experiences. Stories like mine have a way of doing that. I learned to recognize red flags I'd ignored before, the way Marissa spoke about other people's boundaries, how she framed control as care, how she thrived on being indispensable. These weren't things that appeared overnight. They were patterns I'd brushed aside because our history made me trust her intentions. Familiarity can blur judgment. Love can excuse too much. There came a moment, months after everything ended, when I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Marissa, not at myself, not even at the situation. Anger had done its job. It had woken me up. What remained was resolve, a quiet commitment to never abandon myself again, no matter how vulnerable I became. One afternoon, while sorting through old photos, I found a picture of Marissa and me from years ago. We were younger, arms around each other, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. I studied the image for a long time. That version of her was real. So was the version who tried to take my place. People can be both. Understanding that helped me release the need to rewrite the past. I didn't reach out to her. I didn't block her either. I simply let the distance remain. Boundaries don't require constant reinforcement once they're respected, and if they aren't, distance speaks louder than explanations. My illness will always be part of my story. It changed my body, my pace, my understanding of strength, but it didn't define my worth. If anything, it stripped away illusions and showed me who I was when everything familiar fell away. I was still a mother, still a wife, still the center of my own life, even when I couldn't stand upright. Sometimes people ask how I knew Marissa wouldn't stop on her own, how I found the courage to confront her when I was still healing. The truth is, I didn't feel brave. I felt necessary. Necessary to my children, necessary to myself. Courage often arrives disguised as obligation to something you love more than your comfort. If you're listening to this and recognizing someone in your own life, someone who stepped in and never stepped back, I want you to know this. You don't owe anyone your identity. Help is meant to lift you, not replace you, and gratitude should never be used as a leash. I stand in my kitchen now, months later, chopping vegetables slowly, carefully. The house hums around me. Daniel is reading in the living room. The kids are arguing softly over a game. It isn't perfect, but it's ours, and I'm here, fully, intentionally, unapologetically. By the time autumn arrived, I realized how much I had changed. Not in ways people could easily see, but in the way I moved through my own life. I no longer rushed to fill silence. I no longer explained myself more than necessary. I listened to my body with a kind of respect I'd never given it before. Recovery had taught me patience, but betrayal had taught me discernment. There was a neighborhood gathering one crisp evening, the kind with folding chairs, warm drinks, and casual conversation drifting through cool air. I almost didn't go. Crowds still drained me, and part of me wanted to stay wrapped in the safety of home. But something in me said this mattered. Showing up mattered. Not to prove anything to anyone else, but to myself. Marissa wasn't there, but her absence hovered in the space where familiarity once lived. A few people asked about her. I answered kindly, briefly. She moved on. That was all. I didn't feel the need to justify, explain, or correct assumptions. My peace didn't require agreement. One woman, someone I barely knew, pulled me aside near the end of the night. She told me quietly that my story had helped her make sense of something she was going through with her sister. I thought I was crazy for feeling pushed out, she said, but listening to you, it helped. I squeezed her hand, recognizing that look in her eyes, the one that says you're just beginning to trust yourself again. That's when I understood something important. What happened to me wasn't just personal, it was universal. So many women are taught to be grateful even when gratitude costs them their voice, to accept help even when it comes with strings attached, to disappear politely so others can feel needed. We call it kindness, we call it loyalty, but sometimes it's just slow erosion. At home, Daniel and I continued rebuilding trust, not because it was broken completely, but because it had been stretched thin. We talked openly now, especially when things felt uncomfortable. He admitted he'd ignored his instincts because it was easier to accept Marissa's competence than face his fear of losing me. I forgave him, not quickly, but honestly. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing not to carry the weight forward. There was one conversation I hadn't expected to have. Lily came to me one afternoon while I was folding clothes. She asked why Marissa seemed to want to be her mom, too. The question was simple, but layered. I sat beside her and told her that some people want roles they haven't earned because they don't know how to build their own. But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong, I said, and it doesn't mean I stopped being your mom for even a moment. She nodded, then leaned into me, satisfied. Children don't need perfect explanations, they need reassurance. As the year turned, I noticed how my circle had grown smaller but stronger. Some friendships faded quietly after Marissa left, others deepened in unexpected ways. I learned who respected my boundaries without questioning them, who listened instead of judging, who didn't need me to be sick or strong to value me. That clarity was a gift I hadn't asked for, but one I was grateful to keep. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork, I found a medical report from the worst of my illness. Reading it felt surreal, like looking at someone else's life. I remembered how powerless I'd felt then, how much I'd surrendered without realizing it. I placed the report back in the folder and closed it gently. That chapter was no longer controlling the story. I thought about Marissa sometimes, not with bitterness, but with distance. I wondered if she ever reflected on what she'd done, or if she told herself a version of the story where she was misunderstood and mistreated. Either way, it wasn't mine to fix. Accountability doesn't require my participation. Healing doesn't require reconciliation. There's a quiet strength that comes from choosing yourself without anger, from standing firm without cruelty. I had always believed strength was loud, visible, undeniable. But the strongest moment of my life wasn't the confrontation. It was the decision, made silently in my own heart, that I would not disappear to make someone else comfortable. If you're listening and wondering whether it's too late to reclaim your space, it isn't. Even if you've been sick, even if you've been quiet, even if someone else has already stepped into your role and grown comfortable there, presence can always be reclaimed. Dignity can always be restored. Today, my life feels grounded, not perfect, not untouched by what happened, but honest. I wake up knowing where I stand. I move through my home knowing it's mine. I love without abandoning myself. That balance took pain to learn, but it was worth it. Sometimes late in the evening, I sit by the window and watch the world settle. The ticking clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my family existing around me. These are the moments I almost lost, not to illness, but to the quiet belief that I needed to step aside for someone more capable. I didn't step aside. I stepped back in, and that made all the difference. As winter settled in, the world outside slowed, and so did I. There was something comforting about shorter days and longer evenings, about the way darkness arrived early and invited reflection. I spent more time listening than speaking, more time observing the quiet progress of my own healing. It wasn't dramatic. There were no milestones anyone else would notice, but inside me, something steady was forming. One evening, while sorting through holiday decorations, I came across a photo album I hadn't opened in years. It held snapshots of my life before everything changed. Birthdays, vacations, candid moments caught without intention. Marissa appeared in many of them, smiling beside me, arms slung around my shoulders like she belonged there. I didn't rush past those pages. I let myself sit with the discomfort of remembering both the warmth and the warning signs I hadn't seen at the time. Memory doesn't always come with clarity, but it offers context if you're willing to look closely. I thought about how easily roles can blur when someone steps in during a crisis, how gratitude can silence instinct, how fear of being alone can convince you that any company is better than none. These thoughts weren't accusatory, they were instructional. I was learning how to recognize myself again, not just as a mother or a wife, but as a person with limits, intuition, and a right to take up space even when I wasn't at my strongest. Daniel and I continued having conversations that felt different now, less reactive, more intentional. We talked about what support should look like if I ever got sick again, who we'd ask for help, what boundaries we'd set from the beginning. It wasn't a morbid discussion, it was a practical one, grounded in trust rather than fear. We were building something more resilient than what we'd had before, not because we'd been broken, but because we'd been tested. The children, too, seemed lighter. Caleb's quiet watchfulness softened over time. Lily stopped asking questions that carried hidden worry. Our home regained its rhythm, not the old one exactly, but a new cadence shaped by awareness. I realized how much children absorb when adults avoid conflict. They feel the tension even when it's unspoken. Now, with honesty back in the house, they relaxed into being children again. There was a moment one afternoon that stayed with me. I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting mail when Lily walked in carrying her school bag. She dropped it by the door and said, almost casually, "I like it better when it's just us." She didn't mean isolation. She meant clarity. She meant knowing where she belonged. I smiled at her and nodded, understanding far more than she realized. I ran into Marissa one final time months later. It was brief, unplanned. We passed each other on the sidewalk downtown, both of us bundled against the cold. She looked different, not worse, just distant, like someone who had moved on without fully unpacking what she'd left behind. We exchanged polite nods, no words. As I walked away, I felt no urge to turn back. That surprised me. It told me I was truly done. Letting go isn't about erasing someone from your past. It's about releasing their hold on your present. I had carried the weight of that friendship long after it stopped being healthy. Setting it down felt like breathing freely after holding my breath for too long. I began sharing my story selectively, not as a warning, but as an offering. When friends confided in me about feeling overwhelmed or replaced or quietly sidelined, I listened with care. I didn't rush to give advice. I let them arrive at their own understanding. Sometimes all people need is permission to trust what they already feel. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people yet feeling unseen. That loneliness taught me to value presence over proximity. Just because someone is close doesn't mean they're aligned with your well-being. Just because someone helps doesn't mean they honor you. These lessons weren't easy, but they were honest. My health stabilized in ways I hadn't dared hope for at the beginning. I still had limits. I still had days when rest was necessary. But I no longer equated rest with weakness. I saw it as stewardship of my body, my mind, my life. I had learned the hard way that ignoring my own needs created space for others to redefine my role. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I replay the early days of my illness, the way fear crept in alongside exhaustion, the way I clung to anything that felt like certainty. I don't judge myself for those choices anymore. I did the best I could with the strength I had. And when I had more strength, I made different choices. That's not failure. That's growth. If you're listening to this and you're in the middle of something similar, if you're sick, grieving, overwhelmed, or simply worn down, please hear this. You don't have to earn your place by being strong all the time. You don't lose your identity because you need help. And you are allowed to change your mind when help starts to feel like harm. I didn't plan for this story to be a lesson. I lived it first. The lesson came later, slowly, in pieces. It came when I stopped apologizing for existing, when I stopped thanking people for taking what wasn't theirs to take, when I stood quietly and said, "This is my life. I'm still here." That quiet decision shaped everything that followed. By the time spring returned, it felt like my life was finally catching up to the woman I had become. The air smelt different then, lighter, filled with promise instead of fear. I opened windows again. I let sunlight spill across the floors without worrying about drafts or fatigue. Small things, ordinary things, but they felt like proof that I was moving forward, not just surviving. I noticed how differently I occupied space now. I didn't rush to explain myself when I needed rest. I didn't flinch when someone disagreed with me. My voice stayed steady, even when the conversation was uncomfortable. Strength, I learned, isn't about being unmovable. It's about knowing where you stand and staying there without apology. There was a moment at the school pickup line that surprised me. Another parent complained about how hard everything felt lately, how she'd let her sister move in to help and now didn't know how to ask her to leave. As she spoke, her eyes filled with tears she was trying to hide. I listened quietly, then told her she wasn't wrong for needing help and she wasn't cruel for wanting her life back. The relief on her face told me she hadn't needed advice, she needed validation. I recognized that look because I'd worn it myself for months. At home, Daniel and I continued shaping our days with more intention. We created routines that worked with my energy instead of against it. We divided responsibilities clearly, not rigidly, but honestly. There was no longer an unspoken assumption that someone else knew better. We asked each other, we checked in, we treated each other like partners again, not survivors clinging to the nearest solution. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Daniel paused and looked at me for a long moment. "You're different," he said gently. "Not distant, just grounded." I smiled, understanding what he meant. I wasn't smaller anymore. I wasn't trying to make myself easy to manage. I was present, fully, and that presence came with boundaries. The children felt it too. Lily became more confident, less clingy. Caleb spoke up more, no longer watching the room with the same cautious eyes. Stability had returned, not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. Children don't need flawless adults. They need predictable love and clear roles. They need to know who is responsible for them and who belongs where. I spent time reflecting on how easily I'd mistaken endurance for virtue. I had believed that being a good person meant absorbing discomfort quietly, that keeping the peace mattered more than speaking the truth. Illness stripped that illusion away. When you don't have the energy to perform, you learn quickly what actually matters. I learned that dignity doesn't require approval, it requires self-respect. Occasionally, guilt tried to resurface, a whisper asking if I'd been too harsh, too firm, too unwilling to compromise. I listened to it without letting it decide for me. Guilt can be useful, but it can also be a leftover habit from years of prioritizing others over yourself. I learned to separate responsibility from self-blame. I was responsible for reclaiming my life. I was not responsible for how someone else chose to respond. There were days I thought about reaching out to Marissa, not to reconcile, but to explain, to make her understand that I hadn't rejected her as a person, only the role she tried to take. But each time I realized something important. Understanding is not always mutual. Closure doesn't require conversation. Sometimes it comes from accepting that two people can walk away with different versions of the same story, and both will survive. As time passed, the sharp edges of memory softened. The house no longer held echoes of tension. The guest room became a place for visiting relatives, then later a small creative space where I could sit and write or read when I needed quiet. It felt symbolic, turning a space once tied to displacement into one defined by choice. I became more selective with my trust, not closed off, but discerning. I paid attention to how people responded when I said no, to whether they respected my limits without negotiation, to whether their help came with expectations or genuine care. These observations didn't make me cynical, they made me calm. When you trust yourself, you don't need to rush into closeness. Sometimes, late at night, I revisited the early days of my illness in my mind. The fear, the helplessness, the relief of having someone step in. I honored that version of myself now. She did what she needed to do to get through something overwhelming. She wasn't foolish, she was human. And when she regained her strength, she chose differently. That matters. If you're listening to this while lying in bed, exhausted, unsure of who's really on your side, I want you to know something. You're allowed to change the arrangement. You're allowed to say thank you and still say no. You're allowed to outgrow situations that once felt necessary. Needing help does not mean forfeiting your life. My story didn't end with a dramatic victory or public apology. It ended with quiet mornings, steady health, and a sense of ownership over my days. It ended with the knowledge that I can survive vulnerability without losing myself. That lesson came at a cost, but it gave me something priceless in return. I don't live in fear anymore. I live with awareness, and that awareness has made my world feel safer, not smaller. There is a moment that comes after survival, after healing, after the noise fades, when you finally see yourself clearly again. Not the version shaped by crisis or reaction, but the one who remains when everything settles. That moment came to me quietly, on an ordinary morning, while I stood at the sink washing a single cup. Sunlight streamed through the window, dust floating in the air, and I realized I wasn't bracing for anything anymore. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was just living. That realization felt almost foreign at first. For so long, my body and mind had been on alert. Illness had trained me to monitor every sensation. Betrayal had trained me to question every kindness. Letting go of that vigilance took time. But when it finally loosened its grip, it felt like unclenching a fist I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I noticed how my relationships shifted as a result. I spoke more honestly, even when it risked disappointment. I didn't soften my needs to make them easier to accept. When someone offered help, I evaluated it, not by how generous it sounded, but by how it made me feel. Safe help feels respectful. Unsafe help feels urgent, insistent, possessive. I had learned the difference the hard way. Daniel saw the change in me long before I named it. One evening, while we sat together on the porch, he said, "You trust yourself now." It wasn't a question, it was an observation. I nodded. feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. Trusting myself didn't mean I never doubted. It meant doubt no longer ruled my decisions. The children benefited from that trust too. They watched me speak calmly but firmly. They saw me say no without guilt and yes without resentment. These were lessons I hadn't planned to teach, but ones they absorbed naturally. Lily began asserting her own boundaries with quiet confidence. Caleb learned that asking for help didn't mean surrendering control. Our home became a place where strength and softness coexisted. There was one last ripple from Marissa's departure that reached me unexpectedly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned casually that Marissa had moved again. Another new situation, another household where she was helping. I felt a flicker of concern, then let it pass. Patterns repeat until they're faced, but that work wasn't mine anymore. Everyone has to meet themselves eventually. I had already done that work. What stayed with me most wasn't anger or regret. It was awareness. Awareness of how easily vulnerability can be misunderstood for invitation. Awareness of how important it is to protect your inner authority, especially when you're tired, sick, or afraid. I understood now that boundaries are not walls, they're doors you choose when to open. I thought often about the early days, when Marissa first offered to stay. How grateful I'd felt, how relieved. I didn't shame myself for that anymore. At the time, accepting help had been an act of survival. The mistake wasn't needing support. The mistake was not revisiting the arrangement once I was strong enough to see clearly. And even that mistake taught me something valuable. Growth doesn't come from getting everything right. It comes from responding when something feels wrong. I began journaling again, something I hadn't done since before my illness. Writing helped me process the layers of what had happened, not as a victim's account, but as a witness to my own transformation. I wrote about the difference between kindness and compliance, about the quiet power of self-respect, about how reclaiming your life doesn't always involve confrontation. Sometimes it simply involves refusal. There were moments of sadness still. Loss doesn't vanish just because you understand it. I mourned the friendship I thought I had. I mourned the version of myself who believed loyalty meant self-erasure. But grief softened over time, turning into something closer to gratitude, not for the pain, but for the clarity it brought. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old drawer, I found the notebook Marissa had left behind. I'd forgotten about it. My first instinct was to throw it away. Instead, I opened it once more, not to relive the hurt, but to acknowledge how far I'd come. I read the line about things settling into place once I stabilized. I closed the notebook and felt no reaction at all. No anger, no fear, just distance. I threw it away then, not ceremoniously, but decisively. That chapter no longer needed preserving. I wish I could say the lesson came without cost. It didn't. It cost me trust, energy, time I can't get back. But it gave me something more enduring in return. It gave me ownership. Ownership of my voice, my space, my decisions. Ownership that no one can quietly take while I'm distracted or unwell. If you're listening to this and wondering how to reclaim your life when someone has slowly stepped into it, I want you to know that you don't have to justify your return. You don't need to apologize for healing. You don't owe anyone access just because they were there when you were weak. Strength doesn't invalidate the help you once needed. It simply changes the rules. I stand in my life now without fear of being replaced, not because I believe no one will try, but because I know I won't let them. I know the signs, I know my worth, and most importantly, I know that my presence matters, even on my quietest days. This story didn't end with triumph, it ended with truth, and that truth is enough. The truth settled into my days slowly, not as a declaration, but as a rhythm. Mornings became gentler. I stopped rushing through them as if something terrible might happen if I lingered too long in stillness. I made breakfast without checking my phone. I drank my coffee while it was still hot. These were small victories, but they felt monumental because they were mine. There was a Saturday afternoon when the house was unusually quiet. The children were at friends' homes, and the air felt heavy with summer heat. I decided to walk through each room, not to clean or fix anything, but simply to notice. The scuff on the hallway wall from when Caleb had tried to ride his scooter indoors. The faint scratch on the dining table where Lily once carved her initials with a paperclip. The living room couch that still carried the soft dip where I used to sit during my sickest days. Nothing had been replaced, nothing erased. I was still here, and so was my history. I realized then that one of the deepest wounds Marissa had left wasn't the takeover itself, but the implication that I had been temporary in my own life, that while I was weak, someone else could step in and do it better. That thought had haunted me long after she left, but standing there, surrounded by evidence of my life, I understood how wrong it was. No one can replace presence. They can mimic routines, occupy space, even assume roles, but they cannot replace the quiet authority of belonging. Daniel came home that evening carrying takeout, smiling in that easy way he had learned again after everything. We ate on the back steps, cartons balanced on our knees, the sky turning orange and then purple. He told me about a conversation he'd had with a coworker who was struggling with boundaries, letting family overstep in the name of gratitude. Daniel said, "I told him what happened to us." The word us landed softly but firmly. I told him that help without respect isn't help, it's control. I reached for his hand, grateful not just for his support, but for his growth. This experience had changed him, too. He had learned that neutrality can feel like abandonment when someone you love is being overtaken quietly. We both carried responsibility, and we both carried forward the lesson. Later that night, I sat alone on the bed and thought about how illness strips you down to essentials. It exposes your dependencies, your fears, your hopes. It also exposes the people around you. Some step closer with humility, others step closer with entitlement. At the time, it can be hard to tell the difference. They both wear concern like a uniform. But time reveals intention. I thought back to the first week Marissa stayed with us, how she'd reorganized the kitchen without asking, how she'd corrected the children gently but publicly, as if teaching them a better way, how she'd spoken to Daniel with familiarity that made me uncomfortable but too tired to address. These weren't isolated incidents. They were breadcrumbs leading to a place I hadn't wanted to see. Awareness, I learned, often arrives late, but it still counts. I began sharing my story more openly, not in detail, but in essence. When someone asked how I'd managed during my illness, I didn't gloss over the difficult parts. I didn't say, "Oh, we had so much help." I said, "We learned a lot about boundaries." The truth felt lighter when spoken plainly. It no longer needed protection. One afternoon, Lily asked me a question that stopped me cold. She said, "Mom, how do you know when someone is helping you because they love you and not because they want something?" Children have a way of asking the questions adults avoid. I told her that love doesn't rush you, it doesn't take over, it listens, and when you get stronger, it steps back without resentment. She nodded, absorbing it, and I knew that whatever pain she'd witnessed had also given her a compass. There were still moments when I missed Marissa, or rather, I missed who I thought she was, the friend who laughed with me in the kitchen late at night, the woman who held my hand during my first round of tests. Those memories weren't false, they were just incomplete. People are rarely one thing. Understanding that allowed me to grieve without bitterness. I also forgave myself fully, not the kind of forgiveness that still winces at the memory, but the kind that releases. I forgave myself for trusting, for needing help, for not seeing sooner, for surviving in the only way I could at the time. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't about absolving mistakes. It's about acknowledging humanity. As months passed, the story stopped feeling like an open wound and started feeling like a scar, present, visible if you look closely, but no longer tender, a marker of endurance rather than pain. I carried it with pride, not shame. The house felt different now, not because of what had been removed, but because of what had been restored: agency, clarity, peace. I moved through my days without the constant hum of self-doubt. When something felt off, I trusted that feeling and addressed it early. When someone offered help, I asked questions. I paid attention to how they reacted when I asserted myself. Respect became my measure, not charm or history. I don't know what became of Marissa beyond what trickled back through distant connections, and for the first time, I truly didn't care. Her journey was no longer entwined with mine. I wished her no harm, but I also wished her no place in my life. That neutrality felt like freedom. If there's one thing I hope stays with you as you listen, it's this: you are allowed to reclaim your life without explanation. You are allowed to change the rules when your circumstances change. You are allowed to outgrow the roles people assigned you when you were at your weakest. Healing doesn't require permission. I am not the woman I was before I got sick. I am not the woman I was during the worst of it either. I am someone stronger, quieter, more aware. Someone who knows that help should feel like support, not substitution. Someone who knows that presence is irreplaceable. There's something I want to leave you with if you're still here listening to me now. Not advice spoken from a place of authority, but reflection spoken from a place of having lived it. Betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes wrapped in help. Sometimes it wears the face of someone who knows your favorite coffee order, who sat beside your hospital bed, who swore they'd never let you fall. That's what makes it so disorienting. When harm comes from someone you trusted, your mind keeps trying to protect the memory of who they used to be. You replay the good moments, you question your instincts, you wonder if you're overreacting, and in that confusion, you can lose sight of yourself. If you've ever been sick, grieving, overwhelmed, or simply exhausted, you know how thin your defenses can become. Needing help doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. But the world doesn't always honor vulnerability the way it should. Some people step into your open space with care. Others step in and start rearranging it as if it belongs to them. Learning the difference is painful, but it's also powerful. What I learned is that boundaries are not a punishment. They're a form of self-respect, and self-respect doesn't shout. It doesn't justify itself endlessly. Sometimes it simply says, "This is mine," and stands still long enough for the truth to reveal itself. When I finally did that, when I stopped apologizing for wanting my life back, everything changed. You might be listening to this and thinking of someone who slowly took over your role, someone who stepped in while you were down and didn't step back when you stood up again. Maybe they were a friend, a relative, even a partner. Maybe you're still living inside that situation, telling yourself you'll address it when you're stronger, when things are calmer, when it feels less complicated. I understand that hesitation. I live there too. But here's the quiet truth I wish someone had told me sooner. You don't need to be fully healed to reclaim yourself. You don't need perfect words or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes reclaiming your life starts with noticing how you feel when someone speaks for you, decides for you, corrects your children, rearranges your space, or dismisses your discomfort. Those feelings are information. They deserve your attention. Another thing I learned is that justice doesn't always look like an apology. It doesn't always come with accountability or regret from the person who hurt you. Sometimes justice is simply regaining your footing and realizing you don't need their acknowledgement anymore. That kind of justice is quiet, but it's lasting. I also learned that forgiveness, when it comes, should be for your peace, not someone else's comfort. Forgiveness doesn't mean reopening doors. It doesn't mean rewriting history to make it hurt less. It means allowing yourself to move forward without carrying someone else's weight on your back. You can forgive and still choose distance. You can forgive and still choose yourself. If you're someone who prides yourself on being generous, nurturing, dependable, this lesson can feel especially cruel. The qualities that make you loving can also make you vulnerable to being overshadowed. That doesn't mean you should harden your heart. It means you should guard it wisely. Generosity without boundaries becomes self-erasure. Kindness without discernment becomes permission. I look back now and I don't see myself as foolish. I see myself as someone who survives something difficult and learns something necessary. I see a woman who trusted, who endured, who reclaimed. And I see children who learn that strength isn't loud, that dignity doesn't need to dominate, and that home is a place where your voice matters. If you're rebuilding after something similar, be gentle with yourself. Healing isn't linear. Some days you'll feel empowered. Other days you'll feel angry all over again. Both are normal. Both pass. What matters is that you keep choosing yourself, even when it feels unfamiliar. I hope you remember this. No one gets to replace you in your own life, not because you fight harder or shout louder, but because your presence carries something no one else can imitate: your history, your love, your quiet authority. When you stand in that truth, the right people will respect it, and the wrong people will reveal themselves. And if this story touched something in you, if it mirrored a hurt you haven't spoken out loud yet, know that you're not alone. There are so many of us walking around with scars we don't advertise, lessons we learned in silence. Sharing these stories doesn't reopen the wound. It reminds us that we survived. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sitting with me through this. And if you've lived through something like this, I'd love to know how you found your way back to yourself.